todas. Nós vamos começar a sessão desta noite com a palestra do professor Barry Smith, da Science of Responsibility. Então eu vou ler aqui um breve currículo do professor Barry. Barry Smith is a professor of philosophy and director of the Institute of Philosophy at the University of London School of Advanced Study. He is also the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Sciences. He has held visiting professorships at the University of California at Berkeley and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He is a philosopher of language and mind who has published on language, self-knowledge, consciousness, and emotions. He now works mainly on the multisensory perception of flavor and has published in Nature as well as food quality and preference, as well as carrying out consultancy work for the food and drinks industry. In 2007, he published Questions of Taste, The Philosophy of Wine, Oxford University Press. In 2008, the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Language, also Oxford University Press. He is also the wine columnist for Prospect magazine. Welcome, Professor Barry. We look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to you and to Nythamar too. Very happy to be here, but slightly worried as a philosopher talking about issues of science and issues of law, which are slightly further away from my field than I would like them to be. But I think it's true that we have issues that are arising now in the understanding of ourselves and the understanding of the laws that govern our relations with one another that make it important that we look at recent developments in neurobiology and neuroscience from a multiple series of perspectives. These issues are too important to leave just to neuroscientists, and it's also something we need lawyers, we need philosophers, we need psychologists to contribute to. Okay, let's begin. So the criminal justice system, as you know, depends on establishing an individual's responsibility for acts or for behavior. But it's not enough that they behave in a certain way. They have to be intending to behave in this way. They have to have responsibility for their acts. So from Roman times on, we know that there's been the concern to establish mens rea when somebody is deliberately responsible for their behavior. Now, how people behave might be clear enough, might be very clear to know what somebody actually did. We know the facts, we know what happened physically, but we have to make claims about people's intentions, their motives. And we ask what the motive is behind any piece of behavior, and we ask that not only to discover what we think we should say about them morally, but we also ask what was going on behind the behavior in order to determine the category of act they've just performed. So we know in the legal situation that the very same physical activity can be classified as manslaughter or as murder depending on the intentions of the person performing it. So we need to get into the mind of the person as well as understanding what physically took place. And we might wonder whether getting into the mind of the person is easy not only for us, but whether it's easy for the person themselves. Do we always know what our intentions are? Are we always clear about the basis on which we act? So one of the questions that will come up straight away is how much control we have over our actions. And that matters for deciding what crime was committed, if a crime was committed, and deciding what sentencing we should impose. So understanding issues about people's responsibility for behaviour and their intentions behind their behaviour is something which I think now becomes a real challenge when we're learning more and more from the sciences, and in particular from the neurosciences, about how much we might claim to be responsible for things that are not in our control at all, and how some of the time things that are not within our control, that we claim are within our control, might actually show us that the connections we've assumed in the law, the connections we've assumed when we talk about ordinary human moral responsibility, are actually questionable. So let's have a look at these in detail. So how much control do you actually have over your actions? And how aware are you of your actions and intentions? It's interesting that one of the recent, I suppose, signs of change in our description of our own psychology has been the dethroning of our conscious intentions. An awful lot of the things that we think we do consciously, that we decide and that we are capable and responsible for, are actually done by systems at work in us that happen rather automatically and rather easily. You know this in your own case. We want people to be responsible when they're driving down the highway, but we also know that an awful lot of their behaviour is automatic. An awful lot of what they do will happen as a matter of routine, will happen as a matter of practice. Now we can show that people are tempted to ascribe or attribute responsibility to themselves even when they don't have it. Not in the case of brain damaged subjects, but in ordinary cases. So some very nice experiments carried out by Chris Frith and colleagues in London. You have subjects drawing circles on a computer screen, but their hand is under the table so they can't actually see the hand. Instead, what they can see is the circle appearing on the screen itself. What you do as they draw the circles is that you start to make the circles slightly smaller than the circles they are drawing. And what you find out is not that they think there's a mismatch between what they're doing and what they see, but their own hand starts to go into smaller circles. And if you make the circles larger on the screen, then their own hand starts to draw larger circles, and all the time they think they're controlling the process, even though the process is being controlled from somewhere else. So we see again and again very easy demonstrations of the fact that a lot of what we're doing, we're arrogating to ourselves a view of ourselves as in charge, as deciding, as intending, as taking decisions, when actually a lot of these decisions will be going on automatically and easily. So if you can't always know what your intentions are, or if you can't always be sure what you're responsible for, where do we look for the science of responsibility? If it's not about asking the person themselves, and it's not about figuring out from the third person point of view by observing them what they're up to, we might ask whether neuroscience can offer any help or explanation here. Now, neuroscience and the law have been in a very bad marriage for the last couple of years, or certainly the last decade. There's been an awful lot of struggle between people wanting to use neuroscientific evidence in court and other people resisting it. You have very strong resistance advocates like Stephen Morse claiming that there's nothing new under the sun and that neuroscience won't give us any reason to change or give up or revise our practices. And then you've got people who are telling us, well, it would be wrong to convict people of crimes and to treat them as responsible if we actually have some evidence that a lot of the time they have no control over their behavior, and this is a view of what is controlling their behavior that's actually false, that's based on our common sense psychology, and it's a folk psychology. It's as poor at predicting what will actually be the reasons for people's action as folk physics is at predicting the behavior of the planets. So here's one of the cases we know. Damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex can lead to poor impulse control. And we might wonder whether people who have got damage in this area are likely to be as easily held responsible for resisting certain acts, acts of theft, acts of violence, acts against a person, and so on. And should we admit neurological evidence into the courtroom? And if so, how should we use it? Well, here are several views. Green and Cohen, Josh Green and Cohen published a very influential article called "For the Law in Neuroscience Changes Nothing and Everything." Typical intellectual trying to have it both ways. Let's say both things, let's be controversial. At the end, let's say very little at all. The reason why they think neuroscience changes nothing is actually quite controversial, because Green is a psychologist and I guess a sort of neuroscientist who thinks that we never had free will anyway, and the courts have managed perfectly well. So if neuroscience is going to demonstrate we don't have free will, it won't actually change the way the courts operate, because we've been continuing under that way of seeing ourselves for a very long time, and it hasn't made any difference to our practice and decisions. Stephen Morse says the same, neuroscience, old problems. But you have people like Mobbs and colleagues saying neuroscience may have important implications for how we understand the multiple influences on violent behavior and how the legal system can better engage with violent criminals. Now, one thing to be careful of course, is the use of neuroscientific evidence in courts. There's lots and lots of worrying evidence that when either defense lawyers or prosecution lawyers show these pictures of brains, when they show some neuroimaging to the jurors, quite often they're very impressed by this evidence. They think this evidence is highly conclusive, and yet you have to remind people, I'm sure I don't have to remind you, when people say, look, the brain lights up in this area, the brain lights up in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and they show a slide of this sort, brains don't actually light up. Brains don't light up. These are very carefully mathematically constructed images that come from measuring blood flow, a bold signal going to particular parts of the brain, and the reason that the signal is used is because there's a hypothesis. The hypothesis, when you have increased blood flow to a particular area, that means that area is more active and more responsible for performing the task than any other. But that's a hypothesis. It could be that the changes in blood flow have to do with heart regulation, they have to do with the vascular system. So it's a hypothesis, it's not guaranteed. And also, the scans that you see in front of you now are not the scan of an individual. A lot of people think it's like a Polaroid camera. You know, you shove somebody into the MRI scanner, you have a lot of noise, you take some photographs and you bring them out and you say, look, there's what's going on, there's the activation in their brain. Neuroimages like this are usually averaged over many brains that we're watching. So what you're actually seeing is not images with activation from a single brain. You're saying, by and large, statistically, there's increased activation when we look at a large population of people who've been put through the scanner doing a particular task. It's involved in that task that, statistically, most of them are getting increased activation in this area. So we have to be careful about how these images are used in courts, because you've got to explain what the limitations are of scanning and imaging. Okay, but we certainly usually think of ourselves as free agents, and in fact the law, if it's going to attribute blame and responsibility, has to behave as though people are free agents. And we think of ourselves as free agents, weighing up decisions, deciding what to do consciously, and then acting. And you might think that the usual pattern of going on in you, mentally and physically, when you decide and then act, is something like the following. You have a conscious intention. Okay, I've decided I'm going to start speaking now. Then you have the motor areas activated to implement physically that intention. And then you get the resultant behavior, something happens. So if I want to reach for the bottle, I think, okay, I'm going to reach and help myself to some water from the bottle, so I intend to do it. Then the brain is active, and then I pick up the bottle, and then I act. But of course, Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 80s were showing that that's not the order of activity at all. So we don't have this time sequence: conscious intention, motor activation of the brain, action. The Libet study shows instead what you have is motor activation in the brain, followed by conscious intention, followed by action. Now, how does he conclude that? Well, he concludes that from the studies, I'll tell you in a minute, that the conscious intention, or people's report of when they consciously intended to move, is 200 milliseconds before the action, but the premotor areas involved in getting the brain prepared to move the limbs happens 350 milliseconds before. Now here's how the experiment's supposed to go, and it's a very messy, very difficult to believe set of results. What you do is, and here's a colleague of mine from London, Patrick Haggard, who's replicated these studies many times. You have somebody wearing an EEG hat that's recording their brain activity from surface areas, and you say to them, okay, now, I want you to decide to raise your finger, but under your own control. You decide when to do it, and when you have an urge to do it, just raise your finger. While you're waiting to do that, you're looking at a clock with a very fast-moving set of hands, and the subject is told to remember where the clock is at the moment at which they have the urge now to move their fingers. Okay, so they say, okay, you're going to move your finger, and when you think, I'm going to do it now, look and see where the clock is. Taking the measurement of the clock for a measurement of when is the moment of deciding to move the finger, they then conclude that you have ramping up of activity in the premotor cortex. You can see that happening before the point at which they decide to move their finger. So, do the Libet experiments show, as many people have taken them to show, that we don't really have free will, that it's not conscious intention that makes us act, it's not our intentions, because the brain's already getting ready to act, and that the intention is just a sort of comment on what happens afterwards? Is that what the Libet experiments show? No. They don't show that at all, I think. You might distinguish two questions that are never asked of the subjects, but they should be, because they're different questions. One question is, when did you feel the urge to move your finger? Now that's going to be coordinated, assuming you believe that people can do this judgment of when do I feel like moving and where am I looking at the clock. If you believe in those judgments, then you'll say, okay, that was a good timing measure of when they had the urge to move. But when did they intend to move? I think they intended to move when they agreed to participate in the experiment. I think when they said, okay, I will do this, I will get ready, and I will decide to move my finger at some given moment, and they've already intended to move, and they're thinking, no, now. Okay. Now that final bit of decision making, that final fine tuning of, the last moment of letting go, isn't it good that that's done by an automatic system? You don't want every bit of your kind of random decision to sort of let go and release your finger to be based on thinking it through and deciding, or otherwise nothing much would happen. Think of all the things you have to do very fast. If you're skiing and you're skiing downhill and you're coming to a tree and you have to swerve right or swerve left or you'll hit the tree, I hope there's a random system in me that just says, go that way, not, oh, should I think about it, wait, bang. So for rather automatic decisions that don't really matter and where you have to plump one way or another, it's actually rather good that we just offset that. We just send that down to some lower system that does the final bit for us. Does it mean that we don't have free will? No. Our intentions, obviously, if we intend to act, our intentions, we're not dualists, at least I'm not, our intentions have to be implemented in the brain, and so if we have an intention to act, there has to be something physically going on in the brain that realizes that intention. Now that comes before you consciously know, just shows you that it's not conscious intention that's so important, but it's intention. Or it might even be your prior conscious intention when you decided to participate in the survey. So has this experiment showed that we don't have free will? No, I don't think it's shown that. And it's a philosophical mistake of neuroscientists to say it's shown that. What it has shown is that consciousness is not so important, or the moment of consciously doing something is not so important, the urge to move. Now here's a slightly more worrying experiment for you to look at about free will. This is John Dylan Haynes from Berlin, and in his lab he's gone way beyond leave it. What Dylan Haynes gets you to do is he gets you to line the scanner, and you've got a choice of a red button and a green button, and you're asked, do you want to go left or do you want to go right? If you want to go left, press the red button. If you want to go right, press the right button. And he has people pressing the buttons, choosing to do it, and he scans them and scans them and scans them. Now after many, many scannings, he then has a computer-generated prediction that gives him a signal and a warning 8 seconds before the person presses the button to go left or to go right. That is 8 seconds before you think, I'm going to go this way or that way. He already knows. You've already got the neural signature that says it's lateralizing, it's going to be activity in the right cortex. If you're going to use your left hand, it's going to be activity in the left cortex. If you're going to use your right hand. Now that's just the cross-lateral nature of brain wiring. So this looks a little bit worrying, and of course John Dylan Haynes says, well, I have to conclude we don't really have free will, you know, if I can predict which way you're going to go, left or right, 8 seconds before you know it, there isn't the worry about it being all a little messy and a little close. This looks a pretty impressive result. So has he given strong evidence that free will is an illusion, as John himself thinks? Well, to answer that we have to ask, how strong is this evidence? And when you look at the evidence in detail, you actually have to realize the following. Namely that when you classify subjects as going left or going right, you can do it 60% of the time. 60's high, but it's 60%. Not 100%. And that's only of 14 subjects chosen from 36 subjects. Now why did he choose those 14 rather than the whole set of subjects? Because the 14 subjects that he does choose are the ones who seem to be behaving randomly when they go left or right. But it's a good question whether human beings can behave randomly, or whether they can only pseudo-randomize. That is, they don't want to look like idiots, they don't want to go left, 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 nor do they want to do left, right, that looks too clumsy, so they're going to try left, left, right, right, left, right, left, left. But of course they can't actually do that in a completely random way. And so maybe what the computer program is doing is learning what predictive pattern they're making to choose which way they're going, and getting very good at it, okay? So should we be very worried about John Dylan Haynes? No. Should we think free will is an illusion? Not yet. Nice work, but not conclusive. Now the reason that people are worried about neuroscience, I suppose, in the law is because they're worried that people will say things like this: it wasn't me, it was my neurons that did it. This is one of the silliest things I've ever heard. When people say that, if I say it's not me, it's my neurons that did it, where am I? Who am I? Where am I standing, sort of separate from my brain, to say, my neurons did it, not me? Who's the me? I mean, I am partly constituted by my brain, and I can't operate without it. Don't leave home without it. You know, you need it. It's actually going to enable you to do anything, even freely. So I don't think there's any sense in that question, so we shouldn't really worry about that. But there's a nice experiment done by Voss and Schuller. This is a beautiful experiment. Voss and Schuller gave subjects, 2 sets of subjects, passages to read, and told them they were involved in a memory test, so they were to read these passages and then perform a mathematical task. But they told them, the maths task we're going to get you to do, we're going to leave you in a room with a computer and you have to do the maths test. Oh, and by the way, there's a bit of a glitch in the computer. It sometimes shows you the right answer, but try not to just ignore it. And also at the end of the test, we're going to ask you to reward yourself on the basis of how well you did on your score. One set of subjects read a passage which says, we've now discovered that the brain is completely deterministic and that we have no free will, and despite all of our thoughts about it, it's just an illusion. And the other set of subjects reads a passage endorsing free will and saying, of course, we always have the capacity to choose how to act morally. The people who read the passage saying that there's no free will cheat more often on the task and reward themselves more on the task than the people who read the passage talking about the endorsement of free will and moral choice. So, does it have an effect? Well, certainly thinking you're determined has an effect, but it doesn't mean that you are. Okay. And again, determinism is not the issue. An awful lot of the scientists in this area keep saying, well, we've now discovered that we're just deterministic creatures, that what we do is determined by activity in the brain and by the endocrinal system and by all sorts of other physical factors going on in our system at any time, and perhaps the history of that system. But we've had this debate for hundreds of years, and it's a debate in philosophy not between free will or determinism, because philosophers can't decide whether we're in a deterministic universe, and scientists maybe can't tell us conclusively yet either. The debate isn't whether we're in a determined universe or whether we have free will. The debate is whether free will is compatible with determinism or incompatible with it. Okay? It's up to science eventually to discover whether or not we're in a deterministic universe. But if we are, do we still have free will or don't we? And there are different answers. There are some people who argue that free will is compatible with determinism. And that what we mean by free will is absence of restraint, absence of compulsion or impulse or special factors that prevent us from exercising our normal amount of agency. And there are other people who say, no, if there was a deterministic universe, that would show we didn't have free will, because it would show that whatever I was able to do at any moment was determined by the laws of nature and the preceding state of the world. And given that I can't change the past and I can't change the laws of nature, then whatever's going to happen is going to be determined by those factors. And so I don't have free will. Now notice you don't get free will by thinking the universe is indeterministic. Maybe it's random, maybe there's chaos, maybe at the quantum level there's just randomness and chaos. You don't get free will from randomness, because to act freely is to say, when I have an intention, I can carry it out in my behavior, I can follow through causally, I can act on that intention. So if you say, look, what happens is, whatever you're thinking, there's then randomness. That wouldn't give you free will, that would take away free will. There wouldn't be any way of acting on your intentions. So I don't think the issue is about determinism per se, the issue is about compatibilism. But here's the issue I think is more philosophically relevant and more interesting from a legal point of view. I think this is the issue, because we've cleared away all of the side issues and the confusions. This is the issue. If we're free, is it true that some people are more free than others in their ways of behaving? And again, we've known about this for a very long time. There's the case of Phineas Gage, a railway worker, rather peaceable man, rather social, who suffered an accident when there was an explosion on the track, and a bar was plunged, as you see, right up through the eye and right through bits of the frontal cortex. And he suffers a change in personality. He becomes lascivious, rude, badly behaved, aggressive, in a way we haven't seen before. And people began to realize that it was as a result of the injury that we saw these changes in personality. And we know more and more about this now. We know that brain damage can affect personality, decision-making, control of action, can change your risk aversion, your motivation, and your impulsiveness. And all these aspects, which are key parts of how we are going to behave at any time and what's going to determine how we think about one another, all of these depend on our neurobiology. So can we afford to leave them out when it comes to legal reasoning about culpability? Here's a paper by Chris Frith and colleagues and mobs. There is at present no reason to believe that all criminal behaviours, or indeed all violent criminal behaviours, are the result of organically dysfunctional brains. However, there is ample evidence to suggest some kinds of dysfunction are likely to increase the probability of some kinds of behavior that society labels as criminal. So notice all the hedging. It's probable, it's likely. It's nevertheless, they're recommending that we pay attention to this. Several studies also show levels of head injury to be higher in violent and death row criminals than the general population. And medical research indicates that patients with selective damage to prefrontal cortex can often know right from wrong, but still be unable to act on that knowledge. That's interesting because we tend to think that the issue is whether there are people who are, as it were, beyond the framework of responsibility because they just don't know the difference between right and wrong, they're unable to assess it. But here we should be worried about the following case. People do know, they know what they should do, they're perfectly aware, but they still can't act in accordance with that knowledge. That's a sort of dislocation of the normal ways we think our moral awareness and our ability to act go together. And they might not always go together in that way. So a prevailing hypothesis is that in psychopathic criminals, the prefrontal area and the amygdala in the midbrain connections are disrupted, leading to deficits in control, fear conditioning, regret, guilt, and affect regulation. So there are ways in which we know that damage in these areas can mean that somebody doesn't feel any fear under conditions of extreme violence and danger, doesn't feel any regret for the activity or guilt, and their emotions may be very difficult to regulate. So new studies of the criminal brain are likely to shape moral views on responsibility and free will with possible impacts on how the legal system punishes and treats criminals. Now, I'm going to bore you with a little bit of neuroscience for a moment, but the implicated areas that we know about, prefrontal cortex damage, orbitofrontal cortex just here behind the forehead, superior temporal sulcus, the limbic system, the anterior cingulate cortex in the limbic system. Interestingly, orbitofrontal cortex and superior STS are both multisensory areas, so they're kind of areas where lots of information is drawn together. So patients with lesions in the orbitofrontal cortex, especially in medial sections, may develop changes in their interpersonal emotional domain, and lesions there may impair the reversal of learning or social and non-social contingencies because of the intrinsically dynamic nature of social interactions, their importance for moral behavior. OFC patients, or prefrontal cortex patients, may show disproportionate impairments in social behavior. We know that people with damage here, voluntary inhibition of naturally occurring motivations, such as imagined aggressive or sexual impulses, are very difficult to control because they usually recruit the orbitofrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. But with those not working, their ability to inhibit these drives or these areas is missing, and this happens with patients with damage. This is Georgia Moll, Brazilian neuroscientist. Now, Moll, I won't read all of this, but Moll talks about very specific predictions depending on which areas are damaged. So, lesion in the anterior prefrontal cortex leads to impairment in moral evaluations and long-term outcomes. Lesions in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex leads to behavioral impairments in unfamiliar situations. Ventral sections of prefrontal cortex leads to severe social behavioral change and disruption to social emotional knowledge. But the one I'm interested in here is when they say lesions of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, we tend to impair adherence to well-established social norms and attitude, which is consistent with often ensuing personality changes. You can have cases where you disrupt the ability to feel any moral emotions about others when you don't have any feelings or you're not sufficiently affected by the feelings of others. But you have other cases where you can still know what's morally right or wrong, but what you can't control is your impulses. So we're seeing, in a way, a kind of revision to our moral psychology because we're seeing a coming apart of certain characteristics. It could be that you change your ability to feel for others, even though you can still feel for your own situation. It can be that, and that's acquired sociopathy. It can be that you still know what's morally right or wrong, but you can't control your impulses. So all of these things lead to, as it were, a slightly revised version of just a basic category like aggressive or violent tendencies. So if you look at the middle quote here, violent behavior can be placed into two broad yet distinct categories: affective aggression, i.e. impulsive, autonomic, arousing, and emotional, and predatory aggression, which is goal-directed and emotionless. So you've got the kind of cold perpetrator of rather violent and cruel behavior versus the sort of impulsive case. So I think what we're beginning to see is a sort of using this landscape of brain damage to actually revise and nuance our descriptions of categories of moral behavior. Okay, now something to note, warnings. Brain damage defects are not observed in all violent criminals, and conversely, not all people with prefrontal cortex damage exhibit antisocial behavior. Although I've got lots of colleagues who are very prefrontal, but they're not violent, but my God, are they frontal. But just as it would be inappropriate to expect full localization of criminality genetically, the genes determine whether someone's criminal, it would also be inappropriate to expect full localization of criminality neurologically, to think you can just pinpoint something. Despite our growing knowledge of brain abnormalities associated with antisocial and psychopathic behavior, there are as yet no concrete biological markers, genetic or physical, that can predict behavior. So no doubt violent and antisocial behavior arise from a symphony of factors, and we shouldn't treat these as the only ones. Nonetheless, we have to look at cases. What about addiction as far as the courts are concerned? Changes in brain chemistry can lead to temporary or permanent changes in, say, risk-taking or impulsivity in your behavior. I've taken part in one of these experiments, so I know. If you deprive people of water or make them thirsty, you can do it very easily because you just pump their arm full of a saline solution and all of a sudden your throat dries and you feel very, very thirsty. If you get people to perform gambling tasks or play ultimatum games with computers under conditions where they're deprived of food or water, they become much more risk-friendly. They're much less risk-averse. Their risk patterns change. So the thought about this is something like the following. When you're deprived of your basic needs, you're going to take risks. You're going to get out there to try and make sure you can get what you need rather quickly. You're not going to be as careful, you're not going to be as calculated. So that means that even in our own case, through the day, depending on our bodily states, we can have changes in our risk aversion. It's not, as it were, risk averseness is not something fixed in us at all times. Our physiology can change. But more worrying is the long-term changes. You will no doubt have heard of people suffering from Parkinson's disease, Parkinson's symptoms like tremor, and by giving, it's a depletion of dopamine in the system, and by giving L-Dopa, you stop the tremor. But unfortunately, the side effects of this is that you make people very, very impulsive, and a lot of them ended up doing online gambling or becoming completely addicted to pornography. But in the case of online gambling, people were running up debts, they were losing their houses, they were doing things that were putting their family and everyone in jeopardy. Now the courts tried to resist the idea that they should excuse this behavior or excuse them the debts that they were running up by saying, well look, if you know that taking L-Dopa makes you extremely risk-friendly and makes you likely to be addicted to gambling, you just shouldn't gamble, you shouldn't go near it. You should, as it were, use your ordinary reasoning to say, I know that I'm vulnerable to this, keep away from it. But still we might think the salience landscape, the feeling that something is calling you and motivating you and kind of drawing you in is going to be so much stronger than it is for normal people, that it's not the same as you or I thinking, oh, should I do this or not? It's actually, all but impossible to resist the call of it when your dopamine levels go sky high, when you see signs of gambling or you have temptations to gamble. But we also wonder whether that kind of impulsive, risk-friendly, reckless behavior like addiction, is it is it out of your control, or is addiction something you can always decide just by willpower to control? And do we always think it's a bad thing? Do we always think it's pathological? Addicted to risk, Mr. Bond? I love this because he's sitting at a casino table with a cigarette in hand, and if you could look down, you'd also realise he'd a glass of champagne. You know, this is our risk man writ large. Okay, brain damaged. Don't know. Seems to be functioning for Her Majesty's Secret Service. You have to worry about that. So, do we always want to take these cases as though the level of addiction is somehow just to be determined neurologically? No, we societally have to decide what's acceptable and who's acceptable and what we reward and what we don't. Okay, but I want to leave you with two cases that I think are cases that really make us think about neuroscience and the law, because they're hard cases. And of course, hard cases make bad laws, so we have to be careful, but these are cases that have stopped me in my tracks and make me think. This is Burns and Swardlow to clinicians who give the case of a man in Virginia, a 40-year-old man who developed paedophilic tendencies. Now what happened was he was a teacher, he hadn't shown any signs of pedophilia before, he started collecting child pornography, he then started molesting his stepdaughter, and when the stepdaughter told her mother, then he was immediately arrested, he was put under social services, he was put in a 12-step program for sexual addiction and told that if he did that he would avoid going to prison. He did, but while he was on the program he started trying to act inappropriately with people around him and with the helpers in the program, and people thought, no, we're going to send him to prison, this guy's not responding to treatment. He complained of headaches, he was taken to the hospital, he started to be a little unbalanced, and they scanned him and they found this massive tumour pressing on the orbital frontal cortex. So he's got a right orbital frontal cortex tumour, very large. Associated with the tumour were another couple of problems, constructional apraxia. If you ask him to copy drawings, this is very typical of tumours in this area, if you ask him to copy drawings of figures, he can't do it. If you ask him to write, it's illegible. They resected the tumour, so they took the tumour out, and the paedophilic tendencies went away. And indeed the agraphia was cured, he could write legibly, he could draw figures. But the tumour started to regrow, and when it regrew, so the paedophilic tendencies returned, and so he started to behave inappropriately, and he started to be looked at by the authorities and incarcerated again. The tumour was resected for the second time, the problem went away. So here's, this is from Burns and Swardlow. They said, functional magnetic resonance imaging studies indicate that orbitofrontal, as we remember, dorsolateral, prefrontal, subcortical limbic structures, are all involved in behavioral regulation and response inhibition, including conscious regulation of sexual urges. Our patient could not refrain from acting on his paedophilia despite the awareness this behavior was inappropriate. So he was behaving secretively, he was covering up, he knew this was inappropriate behavior, but wasn't able to do anything about it. So what should we say about this man? I think these cases are very, very difficult for us to deal with. Now, there is a kind of worry that people have among the general public, which is to say, well, look, if you say this man has got a brain tumour and that therefore he's not responsible for the things that he was doing, is he to be excused for some, morally unacceptable and particularly unpleasant behaviour? Well, remember, if somebody is not responsible because they have no control over their behaviour, they have no way of regulating their impulses, we're just as likely to lock them up. In fact, we're more likely to lock them up. It's not as though saying he's not responsible for his behaviour means that somehow he walks free from the court. It might mean that for the protection of society and for the protection of children, that we might actually have to take him into custody and incarcerate him. So An awful lot of defense lawyers don't seem to see this coming down the tracks. You know, they're running around trying to get scans of their clients and saying, look, it's not his fault, but it might be, well, if it's not his fault and he really has no control, we might have to take away his liberty. So it's not a get out of jail card, exactly. So what is neuroscience telling us about decision-making, impulse control, motivation, control of action, sense of agency in normal and pathological subjects? And should we use this evidence in court cases? I certainly think you need to use that evidence of this man we've just been talking about in any court case. You can't just go through the courts in the normal way. It's something we have to pay attention to here and do something about. Now, I think these recent findings are, to some extent, revising our sense of ourselves and our ordinary folk psychology. It's showing us that how we are as normal subjects depends on a configuration of systems all at work and areas of the brain all behaving normally and collaborating together. And when they're functioning normally and when there's a sort of working orchestral symphony of these things going on, we are able to regulate our behavior, we are able to understand our consequences of our action, we're able to govern and judge what we're doing. But if you damage one of these areas, we're beginning to understand more about what happens when you take part of that symphony away, when you take part of those mechanisms away. And what we might be left with is not something that says you've got a person who's just hard to understand, impossible to understand, we treat them as somehow inhuman. But instead we might realize that we have more commonality with those people. There but for the grace of God go I. You might think there's a sense in which I can see that if I didn't have all of the components working in me, and if I had one of them missing, I might find myself in this condition. Now with the guy who has the orbitofrontal tumor and paedophilic tendencies, I don't think it's true that anyone with an orbitofrontal tumor is going to have paedophilic tendencies. I would like to know an awful lot more about what that man was doing before he was in that state. I'd like to know what his imaginings and his fantasies were. Maybe he was able to control this, maybe he was able to avoid it, to distract himself or not to act on it. But it's a very specific thing that happens as a result of this tumor, and I don't think we should go away with the idea that the tumor is responsible for all of it. But we have to revise our thinking nonetheless. So is the defendant culpable? Were they able to decide? How should we respond to in sentencing? What treatments should we recommend for someone? Here's a question that never gets asked by lawyers. If we're going to ask that subjects or clients or defendants are scanned, don't you want the jurors to be scanned as well? And maybe even the judge? Geez, I don't want somebody sitting in judgment of me or deciding my fate who's got a very large tumor that's impeding their ability to reason well or making them more impulsive. So, just something to remember. It's not all one directional. So another thing that's obvious is that, should we use MRI and fMRI in personal injury cases? So when somebody has suffered injury through a violent attack, and then they say the quality of their life has been damaged, we might want to know in a very particular way, what are they unable to do, how is their life going to be affected, what's the long-term consequence? And it doesn't seem to me that we should resist using it there. That's medical information that we need. Now, if you're going to use it there, we're going to allow it already into the court. Some people don't want it in courts at all. But we allowed fingerprinting, we allowed DNA profiling. We'll eventually have to allow it in, but it's a question of how do we use it? Do we use it sensibly? Do we use it with an informed sense? So here's the final case for you to consider. This is a paper that just came out this year, and it's causing quite a bit of fuss already. It's called The Neuroprediction of Future Rearrest. Paper looking at the criminal justice system and 96 criminals incarcerated in New Mexico. So should we use neurobiology in cases of risk assessment to predict whether somebody is going to reoffend and whether they're going to be guilty of antisocial behavior? So here's the finding. An error-related brain activity elicited during the performance of an inhibitory task prospectively predicted subsequent rearrest among adult offenders within 4 years. And the odds that an offender with relatively low anterior cingulate activity would be rearrested were approximately double that of an offender with high activity in this region, holding constant other observed risk factors. So these results suggest a potential neurocognitive biomarker for persistent antisocial behavior. So they did a longitudinal study and they found that they could predict with much, much higher rate of success than any of the panels, than any of the experts who are used to deciding and judging whether somebody would be set free or whether they should remain incarcerated. Much higher prediction based on measuring activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, which is used not just for emotion control but for decision making, cognitive impulse control and decision making. So they say risk assessment is a major component of criminal justice and treatment decisions, and one crucial application of such predictions is the ability to identify, manage, and remediate antisocial behavior. Decisions that rely on antisocial risk prediction pervade the justice system, beginning with recommendations for bail, jail, probation, and so on, treatment. Initial attempts to predict future antisocial behavior based purely on clinicians' opinions have been shown to be highly inaccurate. People do very badly at that when they're predicting reoffending rates. But one of the strongest and most widely studied risk factors for recidivism is impulsivity or behavioral disinhibition, the persistent lack of restraint and consideration of consequences. Now they point out that risk assessments, personality tests, neuropsychological measures have been used to assess impulsivity and have demonstrated the ability to predict antisocial behavior. However, these latter measures only serve as proxies, whereas what the neuroimaging is doing is actually scanning the very mechanisms that are responsible for inhibiting or allowing disinhibition in subjects. So rather than saying, here's some evidence that seems to be highly correlated with people being impulsive or inhibited, they're actually looking at the very mechanisms in the cortex and in the limbic system which are responsible for it. And so they say the brain regions associated with impulse control have been well characterized, consistent among these regions, anterior cingulate cortex. Now, cingulate damage has been shown to produce changes in disinhibition, apathy and aggressiveness. Indeed, ACC damaged patients have been classified in the acquired psychopathic personality genre. So just to tell you how the test is conducted. The test is conducted like this. You show people on the screen an X, you flash up an X, and you're told, when you see an X, I want you to press, yes for correct. But there's a distractor. They flash up a K every now and then. And you mustn't press K. If you press K when it's on the screen, then that's an error. So what you have to do is, you're getting a lot of X's, so you're pressing very, very frequently. And when the K comes, there's a temptation to press 2, but you have to inhibit that. Now, the people who are very bad at inhibiting their error rate or correcting for it have got very low activity in anterior cingulate cortex. And those who have increased activity seem to be better at inhibiting and controlling behavior. And then, by scanning these subjects, they then predicted that the ones with low activity, low activation in the anterior cingulate cortex will be more likely to be arrested within 4 years of release than any others, and indeed they were about double the rate of those who had high activity in the cingulate cortex. But can we use performance in inhibiting response on a go, no-go task to deprive people of their liberty? Should we use this? Well, the results are clear enough, and we certainly know that a probation panel has to make those decisions. Now, notice that some people might say at this point, oh, well, if you scanned people and found they had low activity in the ACC and then said, I'm going to deprive you of your liberty, this is sort of future crime. You're doing something to take away their liberty, as if predicting criminal behavior before they've engaged in it. But that's exactly what a probation panel does when they decide, do we release them, do we not? They're making that prediction. So if this is better predicting, shouldn't we use it? Well, the question is still, should neuroimaging data replace legal judgment? Do we just dismiss all the legal people and just put everybody through the scanner, and if you reach a certain threshold, you can get out, and if you don't, we keep you in? Do we do that? No. So the author's caution is interesting. I want just to quote what they say, because quite often these studies get reported by journalists who don't read the small print, and we need to read the small print. Okay. Should the neuroimaging effects be robust to replication, they remain silent on the question of suitability in making individual level predictions. Why is that? That's because, remember, I told you that when you're scanning people, you're not looking at individual brains. Those images are summations over lots of brains and saying, by and large, statistically, there's evidence that this is responsible, presence or absence of activation is responsible for task performance. So can you use it for individual level predictions? Maybe not. Whether neurobiological markers ever should be used to make predictions about individual offenders' risk is a thorny question that at least depends on whether these estimates can survive particular sensitivity and specificity thresholds within the use of large random samples, and whether they can survive a required legal standard of proof, and whether their use would violate offenders' rights. If somebody refuses to be scanned, do we say we're not going to consider you for release? It's only if you go through this that we've got enough evidence to consider. There's a question there. These are the neuroscientists writing it, but you won't find journalists quoting this when they quote the headline of the paper. And they also go on to say this: it is noteworthy that existing clinical risk assessment tools, including those reliant on personal health information about the offender, already permeate criminal justice decision settings such as civil commitment decisions. We are skeptical that emerging neurobiological markers could ever independently outperform those existing tools in sensitivity and specificity, but they could potentially improve overall risk estimates in combination with known psychosocial risk factors. If so, their potential admissibility in legal settings may be greatest in decisions involving a low standard of proof, such as treatment access decisions rather than high-stake decisions such as sentencing. So it's careful, nuanced stuff, and I think in these debates one has to be very careful not to polarize and not to think these are scientists arrogantly telling lawyers how to behave. I don't think that's always true. So the goals of neuroscience and law are different. The law involves attribution of blame, responsibility, relying on both normative concepts and an understanding of the role of the human mind in decision and action. So neuroimaging may aid legal decision making based on empirical or psychological claims about the motives and causes of human behavior, but it is one factor to weigh along with other social factors when trying to understand decision making and action. We can't operate in the moral domain without supposing people are responsible for their actions, but additional information can mitigate those decisions. Does neuroscientific data excuse our activity? Maybe, but we still deprive people of their liberty to protect the public. So having free will may guarantee liberty, but lack of it may not. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Berry. Now we invite Professor Nythamar to present his comments.
Well, thank you, Barry, for such a brilliant, profound, thought-provoking paper. As I told you, I don't feel I'm the right person to be a respondent to this paper of yours, but I'll try to offer a few comments, especially relating to three main problems that you raised with your presentation, and of course somehow related to my own interest in neurophilosophy. Here at PUC, we were first introduced to the neurohypes of neuroscientific turn that's taking place in Brazilian philosophy, and of course with a little help from our good friends Adriano, Marco, and several other friends, Norman, who work with us in the at the Brain Institute, and especially with the kind collaboration from my scholars like yourself, and Professor Damasio, Jesse Prince, and others. We are proceeding with this interdisciplinary research in neurophilosophy. So one first topic that I would like to focus on in my response to your paper is relating to what you said about intention, decision-making, and free will. Of course, as you put it so clearly, this traditional model of going back to a conscious intention, moral areas activated in the brain, and then action has been a challenge since Libet's experiments in the 80s seem to demonstrate the absence of a free will. And as you very emphatically said, no, this is not the case, because it's not that the brain is making a decision. Of course, to say that the brain does anything would be a so-called neurological fallacy, right? When we are thinking, taking the parts for the whole. And I was thinking that Damasio's work here could be also very helpful as a way of responding to this kind of, let's say, if not caricature, but at least quite reductionist account of Libet's experiments. So in Damasio's famous book on Descartes' error, it was already the idea of going beyond this reductionist naturalist response to the Cartesian substance dualism, and especially with his theory of emotions, which was later on critically appropriated by Jesse Prince. There we see the James Lang conception of emotions as bodily patterns, changes in the body, contributing to the formation of rationality and whatever is understood as decision-making process leading to practical reason, action, and the election of ends. So Damasio himself said that he was writing the book in order to show that reason could not be taken as pure as most of us think it is or wish it were, but that emotions and feelings may not be intruders in the bastion of reason at all. They be enmeshed in its networks for worse and for better. So overall we have this development starting with Descartes' error, but then leading to his subsequent work in a very interesting theory of emotions, leading to a conception of self-formation or selfhood, and especially the conception of a conscious brain. So we have this order of a feeling, perception, emotion, consciousness, self, and reason. And what he says about human reason is depending on several brain systems working in concert across many levels of neuronal organization rather than on a single brain center. So as opposed to functionalist traditional conceptions of the brain as the center for decision-making process. One thing that we found fascinating in our own ongoing research here at PUC is the very idea of taking together both cognitive and non-cognitive elements in this whole process. And as you already mentioned, the famous reconstitution of Phineas Gage accident, and especially the upshot of this for his somatic marker hypothesis, as we think that even though Gage had his normal intellectual function and normal neuropsychological function, these impairment in personal and social decision making and conduct were really intriguing, and unless we come up with some more interesting explanation, as Damasio himself was proposing, this would be very, very much lacking in terms of a normativity. So his idea is precisely that this deficit in reasoning is secondary to deficits in emotional processing. So for your presentation, I was especially struck by the idea of thinking of the normative grounds for neuro law or neuroscientific approaches to law, in that we cannot we can no longer speak of a normatively expected situations in terms of normative claims without also taking into account the different deficits that we see in neurobiological accounts. So my idea here is precisely trying to combine these more properly neurobiological account as you offered, and I ask you to help us make sense of what would be the social brain component for this kind of problematic. So I was thinking especially in terms of Damasio's as if loop conception of these hypotheses, as we think, as you mentioned, in examples of driving and so many activities where we are not doing this instant decision, which would be a part of the problem with Libet's experiment, right? So at the end of the day, we have to see that these changes in bodily state or in ways that would betray any kind of a rational or rationalized account of whatever is taking place. Since it happens so fast, it's because it has to do with decisions that were made previously. Since we think of some important decision to be made, of course, if we think in terms of a fair trial or decision that would make in the court, of course, this is not anything that would be related to moving a finger, right? So the difference, according to Damasio, is that we deliberate on the more important decisions for long periods of time. In other words, there has been an entire socializing process or context of history, self-narratives, of our own self-perception, self-understanding, prior to coming up with a very fast decision in 200 milliseconds, let's say. So in the feeling of what happens, he says, Damasio, emotions can be induced in a non-conscious manner and thus appear to the conscious self as seemingly unmotivated. So again, there are lots of non-cognitive or other elements which are not being accounted for, but which would be also a part of our past experience. Now, moving on to the second question, and I quote you, all these aspects of us depend on our neurobiology. So thinking of Gazzaniga, he was quoted in one of your seminal papers that you shared with us. This was the very idea of the social brain, as we think not only in terms of biological evolution, of the cortex or the neocortex, but also thinking in terms of third personal accounts being combined with first personal accounts of meaning and selfhood. And for Damasio, that means that precisely because we have this feedback or this social homeostasis, that we can make sense of both third personal and first personal accounts. Now, I would like to provoke you with one of your own papers on Davidson's conception of this radical interpretation, and as you proposed to bringing in these first personal and sub-personal aspects of a speaker's competence in order to make the significance of speech and to make more defensible, both for Davidson's and Quine's idea of a radical translation. As you pointed out, even in Davidson, we can think of materials that could point towards a more speaker-centered account of meaning. By adding experience to Davidson's scenario of triangulation, we can bridge the publicly interpretable content of a speaker's utterance and the immediate first-person accessibility they have to the speaker. So here again, I was thinking that intersubjectivity for the neural law problem, just as you put to us, was something that could be very interesting reviewed. Now I'm coming to my last point on revising our sense of ourselves. Overall, I think that in critical theory, and I think of Habermas and Honneth, but also in different accounts that we find in analytical contributions to theories of justice. We had these with Taylor's A Source of the Self, Sandel's criticisms directed against Rawls' conception of the self. We are always revising our sense of ourselves. As we revise our sense of ourselves, our ordinary folk psychology, so I'm asking you, aren't we also revisiting our most common sense intuitions, both moral and social, such as a sense of justice? Here is one of those funny cartoons. Anthropologists, so hide the TV sets. So we go back to this idea of ourselves that were originally conceived in an original position, of course as a heuristic device of representation, and that could be very misleading. But in the Rawlsian idea of a sense of justice, several people have gone back to this idea, especially in authors like Jonathan Haidt with his idea of associative intuitions, and even in Joshua Green's, in his collection and different comparisons of moral dilemmas, that we have to make sure that ideal theory and non-ideal theoretical features of a conception of justice should be brought together in reflective equilibrium. So the very idea of a revision or revising our social moral intuitions means precisely that we cannot take for granted any kind of a foundation or any kind of grounding for normative conceptions. So in this sense, I'm already assuming that in your neuroethical approach, we have undertaken this post-pragmatic turn of experimental philosophy, or towards experimental philosophy. So in the kind of research we're developing here at PUC, we undertake this revision of moral and social intuitions of justice in a democratic ethos as shared beliefs and social norms that were traditionally assigned to socialization, selfhood, and subtle mechanisms of subjectivation. So my provocation here, or what I would like to hear from you as a way of responding to these provocations, is how can we make sense of these very complex neural correlates, as you put in your presentation vis-a-vis socialization, or the social dimensions of this formation of a self, thinking of a theory of emotions, thinking of all the different empirical findings that make us try to make sense of culpability or guilt without falling into any kind of reductionist reading. Because of course, from a, let's say, if we think in terms of a social reductionism, it will be very tempting for someone coming from the social sciences to speak in terms of, well, this is the way someone is socialized into taking guilt. And I'm thinking here, of course, it's one interesting question for your presentation, how you differentiate between guilt and feeling guilty, or the self-perception of guilt. Because in many social cultural accounts, we can say that, of course, the Greeks, for instance, they didn't think as much of guilt as opposed to people who belong to Judeo-Christian traditions, as opposed to, say, honor, as it happens to be the case with the Japanese, right? If we think of Ruth Benedict's famous studies, comparative studies on cultural relativism. So in my own understanding of what would be taken as weak naturalism, we make possible this compatibilism, as you offered in terms of moral reflection of neuroethics, that we can take both the empirical causality of neural correlations and the very idea of a freedom, or the way we think of people having different stories or different ways of reflectively responding to social context or to their own environment. So in this sense, and I'm about to finish, I think that even in Pat Churchland, we can find already this attempt to bring together the social component with the neurobiological correlates. And again, of course, in some way, a lot of people would find Patricia Churchland's account too reductionist. But I can see that you don't have to go all the way back into a Kantian response, as Korsgaard has proposed, or not necessarily into a relativism, as our good friend Jesse Prince is proposing. So I would like to hear, in your own personal position, in terms of cultural relativism, whether you think that these accounts could somehow lose sight of the normative force of moral claims. So even though we can no longer go back to some kind of divine command theory, we can see that Kantian-inspired rationalist ethics have been under attack, together with utilitarian and teleological models. If we are still taking these different models in reflective equilibrium, it's always possible to come up with some kind of account with which not necessarily dismiss naturalism as something that cannot be pursued and maintain commitment to normative facts, as Parfit and others try to do. So in Brazil, and I'm going to finish with this, we use this as an experiment that several of our European and American visitors ask, well, does PARE stand for stop? And how come most people don't stop at stop signs in Porto Alegre? So of course we can speak in terms of habits, thinking more of a socializing or socialization explanation. But once again, in terms of normativity, we can think of a different accounts of ethical, legal, linguistic normativity, economic normativity, epistemic normativity, you name it. But at the end of the day, the problem we have here is that there is no way we're going to take one zero-ground account of normativity to be decisive or to provide a solution to these problems. At least this is a part of my skeptical attitude towards different foundationalist accounts. So I was particularly curious to see how you'd respond to this when in your own paper on Davidson, you brought together the syntactic and the semantic approach precisely in a way that would challenge, for instance, John Searle's take that without the semantic approach, of course, it's impossible to come up with a syntactic solution to this problem of normativity. And here I'm going to stop with this last quote from Damasio. This is from his book on Spinoza. Again, I'm thinking of a social homeostasis or reflective equilibrium. The failure of past social engineering experiments is due to the sheer folly of the plans or the corruption of their execution. Both the failure also may have been due to the misconceptions of the human mind that informed the attempt. The misconceptions resulted in a demand for a human sacrifice that most humans find difficult or impossible to achieve. In an ignorant disregard for the aspects of biological regulation that are now becoming scientifically transparent and that Spinoza intuited in the Conatus, and in a blindness to the dark side of social emotions that finds expression in tribalism, racism, tyranny, and religious fanaticism. Thank you.
Should I say something quickly? I don't want to take up time if people have questions, but can I just, there is a big issue about how to find room for normativity, that's true, and I don't feel suitably capable of saying anything much about that at this stage. I guess I'm sort of broadly Humean about that way of working. The great Scott did most of the things that we needed right. The only thing in Scotland that we criticise Hume for is waking Kant from his dogmatic slumbers. Crime. But no, I think normativity is the big issue. I think normativity is the big issue for any naturalist to face. That's right. Let me say two quick things and then I'll stop because you raised a lot of very interesting issues. So it's true that we have to lay emphasis on intersubjectivity if we're going to look at the social, but there are two aspects of social cognition or social brain that I think we're beginning to understand. One of them we knew nothing about, and it's taken some very clever work in neuroscience to point out to us, and that has revised, I think, our understanding of where to look for interesting work on how we bind together and how we make common cause and how we fit together and understand each other. And I think it was completely unknown and it's come to light. And the other is not so much revising our sense of ourselves, but reclaiming a sense of ourselves that we lost by having rather abstract philosophical models of the social. So here's the bit we didn't know. Interoception turns out to be very important for social cognition. So interoception is the ability you have to register changes in your own bodily state, changes in your heart rate, changes in your state of arousal or excitement, butterflies in the stomach. When you are able to recognize changes in your own body, in your own bodily state, it turns out that people who are better able to do that, people who have better awareness of their own internal bodily state, are better and quicker at recognizing the emotions of others than those who can't do it. So that's very interesting, and you can perform a very simple task. We could, if we had extra time, we could perform it now, which is, I say to you, okay, I'm going to ask you to estimate how many heartbeats you have in a minute, So I'm going to start the watch and I'm going to say, okay, starting now, just count your heartbeats. And people say, they do this or they, no, just just tell me, just estimate. And it turns out that some people are very, very accurate and some people are hopeless. And it also turns out that people are very accurate, even though they don't know they can do it, they say, well, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but they're accurate. The ones who are accurate are better and quicker at recognizing other people's emotional states changes. And that's interesting, because that we didn't know. That means that it may be that you can teach people to be better aware and more responsive to other people by actually getting them to learn about and respond better to their own internal states, by giving them biofeedback and actually getting them to be aware of their changes. This research, I think, has got lots of possibilities. It's rather big and rather important. It may also have to do with why people have eating disorders. They may be much less aware of changes in their bodily state. There are all sorts of applications of interoception that I think are important, but they're socially important, we didn't know. The second aspect that's socially important, and we do know it, but we forgot about it because we were being philosophers, and in some sense neuroscientists have been more nuanced and subtle than we have, and that's, instead of first person and third person, it's second person neuroscience. So there's a lot of work on second person neuroscience. The engagement we have with others, the connection we have with another person is terribly important, and it's terribly important from the get-go. It's terribly important to the child. I mean, before a child can speak, and when a child is just learning to think, at the age of 2 months, children, infants, pay special attention to somebody paying attention to them. The child is suddenly moved and excited when somebody's looking at them, and they can be a bit shy, and then they can look back, and it can all be a bit too much, but they're aware of another's gaze, they're aware of another's attention to them, and that kind of close binding, that sort of immediate sense of being in touch with another person, I think is a large foundation for the relations we have with others. And one ought to sort of ground social and even political dimensions on the second person, rather than starting with these rather abstract third person points of view. So I think that's a sort of way of reminding us. It's also interesting for morality, because some nice experiments that were done where a lot of bicycles were being stolen from a campus in Canada, and so where the bike stand is, they put a poster of 2 huge eyes, just eyes looking. And the rate of stealing of bikes went way, way down. They started stealing from elsewhere, where they didn't have the eyes. But that's interesting, right? Because that suggests it's about, well, if someone was looking at me, if you were looking at me, I wouldn't do it. So again, it's not about what are the abstract set of rules we should have, but it's about that engagement with another person that determines a moral space and a moral environment. So I think that's become terribly important. So I think both learning about how physiological changes in us have a relation to our awareness of others, and then learning how social and emotional engagement with others is much more rooted in the second person and third person is going to be very important.
Now we have time for questions and comments. Eu pediria assim que as perguntas fossem precisas e concisas, para depois, todos estamos um tanto cansados já do dia, né? Então, por favor. Como você vê, vamos fazer uma rodada de 3 perguntas, então, por vez. Então, Sinara, depois Araújo e aqui. Só um momentinho, virar o microfone.
Thank you very much for a brilliant conference. I'd like just to discuss a little bit more, or know a little bit more about your conclusions. Because I totally agree with you that the experiment, the Libet experiment, and the so-called revised Libet experiments, that the one that you mentioned with Heinrich and the Max Planck group, really doesn't show that free will doesn't exist. I entirely agree with you. But I'm not that convinced with the second one about pedophilia, because I think that in this case the evidence is more strong. that in a certain sense, the tumor is causing the pedophilia behavior. And even if it's not the case, that now, because you have the instrument is not enough for us to, the instrument is not good enough to make some predictions, we can suppose that one day you're going to refine our instruments, and then you're going to be able to make this kind of predictions, and you're going to be able to predict that the people are going to have a pedophilic behavior, or even that, as you mentioned, the other behavior, the other experiments, that are going to be able to foresee if people are going to have, criminal behavior. And then this is exactly my question to you. What do you think that we should do then in this case? I mean, you think that the state should be the right to, in a sense, scan brain people to know if they are, in a certain sense, they are more likely than others to, behave, to commit crimes, or, what you should do is the question.
Mr. Araújo.
Thank you for your lecture. Yeah, at a certain moment during your lecture, you mentioned that the real issue is to know whether some people are more free than other peoples, and then you have shown some evidence, some piece of evidence that suggests that some people are more or less free than other people, to the extent that they are less able to stop themselves from behaving a certain way. So the question is, assuming it's a plausible account of what's really going on in the brain, do you think you have a reason to morally improve the behavior of a person like this? That means that it's also our duty to fix his or her brain, or to morally enhance this person. And if yes, it might sound like a bit of a paradox, because if we improve them, it means we make them more free. But it also looks like hampering with their freedom of will. That means we make them free to the extent that we violate their freedom in a certain sense.
Vamos ouvir o Marco, por favor. A segunda rodada, professor.
Well, thank you. Perhaps three questions quickly. One is about mens rea, or the first mens rea, limit, and the problem of predictability. About mens rea, the idea is that responsibility implies mens rea. This is a common assumed conception by moral philosophers, but not necessarily by all legal philosophers. For example, Kelsen criticizes the idea, and so positivists think that we can have a legal theory without mens rea. But in philosophy, moral philosophy, you accept the idea that responsibility implies mens rea. And if I understood your point, is that if mens rea means conscious mens rea, so neuroscience has evidence that this idea is wrong, that responsibility, even if our concept of responsibility implies mens rea, since we don't have mens rea as conscious mens rea, we have to abandon our conception of responsibility. But we should not abandon this I understood of your position, because mens does not mean conscious mens rea. This is your point that this is I accept. But Libet, quickly, Libet actually said that conscious, of course, is not in the beginning, as you pointed out, but it can have a power of veto. He said that that conscious could veto the action, and this is a kind of a strange view on the power of conscious actions. And I would like to know, to hear what you know that this is in the beginning, even in the abstract. He said that, and what do you think about this kind of strange position of Libet?
I can respond to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a crazy idea of Leavitt. Leavitt thinks we haven't got free will, but we've got free won't. So he thinks that we can veto the action, but if we can veto the action, then the decision to veto was already happening before we thought about it, and so so you have to keep your ducks in a row, as we say in England. You have to you have to be consistent. There's no room for free won't if there's no room for free will, because equally the vetoing decisions would all come prior to the consciousness to veto. So that doesn't help. Mens rea